Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. David is forced to flee for his life, and you would think that this brings any chance of him becoming the next king of Israel to an abrupt and ignominious end. But in reality, this is just the beginning of David's life story, and it's all part of God's divine plan for his life. When David runs, he does so filled with confusion and self-incrimination. He can't figure out what he has done to make Saul so angry with him. He even begs Jonathan to help him determine how to make things right with his father. Jonathan is convinced that David is overreacting. He can't bring himself to believe that his father is serious about his threats to kill David. So David concocts a plan to expose Saul's real agenda and to convince Jonathan that the threat in his life is real. But the most amazing part of this story is the way David handles himself throughout the entire ordeal. He's confused, but shows no signs of anger or resentment. He doesn't lash out at Saul or call on God to strike him down. If anything, he seems to be willing to take the blame for the conflict taking place between them. He exhibits the characteristics that led God to call him a man after his own heart. It would still seem as though David was unaware of the true meaning behind his anointing by Samuel. He was at a loss as to why Saul would want to kill him. He even asked Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I offended your father that he is so determined to kill me?" If David had been aware that he was to be the next king of Israel and Saul's replacement, then he would have put two and two together and recognized Saul's attempts on his life for what they were, acts of jealousy and anger. But instead, David seems to think that he has done something to offend Saul. He's trying to figure out what he could have done to cause such anger in the king that he would want David dead. David even begged his friend Jonathan, "Kill me yourself if I have sinned against your father, but please don't betray me to him." 1 Samuel 20, verse 8. The difficult part of this story is that David's fear for his life was well justified. Saul was out to kill him. But what made it all so difficult was that David was oblivious as to the reason. He couldn't figure out why the king was so angry with him, angry enough to want to kill him. How many sleepless nights must David have had trying to determine what he had done to deserve such rage? It seems that David would have gladly confessed whatever it was he had done to offend the king, if he could just figure out what it was. Years later, David would compose a psalm that reflects his innate desire to have a guilt-free conscience. David was not one who was content to live with unconfessed sin in his life. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." Psalm 139, verses 23 through 24. But no matter how hard he tried, David was not able to find a sin to confess or a crime he had committed against Saul for which he could accept responsibility. So he was left with no other option than to run for his life. But he appealed to Jonathan in a last-gasp attempt to resolve his situation with Saul. The reference in this passage to the new moon has to do with a God-appointed sacrifice and meal that was to be celebrated on the first day of each new month. David's plan was to use this feast day as a means to discern the true nature of Saul's relationship with him. He usually celebrated this feast day in the presence of the king and his family. But on this occasion, David would remain in hiding, and Jonathan would tell Saul that he had returned home to Bethlehem to be with his family. If Saul became angry, as David seemed to know he would, it would be proof to Jonathan that David's fears were well justified. And the truth is, Jonathan should have been well aware of his father's intense anger with David, because Saul had already commanded Jonathan to kill him. But Jonathan, a loyal son, was probably having a difficult time understanding what was really going on. He knew Saul loved David just as much as he did. His father's actions were a mystery to him. Jonathan so wanted everything to return to the way it was before, but sadly, that would not be the case. Jonathan made a pact with David, saying, "I promise by the Lord, the God of Israel, that by this time tomorrow, or the next day at the latest, I will talk to my father and let you know at once how he feels about you." 1 Samuel 20, verse 12. And Jonathan made David swear that no matter what happened, he would remain faithful to him. "And may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth." 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 through 15. Jonathan seemed to know that God's favor was on David. He sensed that David was going to go on to great things and continue to experience victories over the enemies of God in Israel. And Jonathan also seemed to have a premonition that things were not going to turn out well for he or his father. Years later, after Saul and Jonathan were dead and David was king, David would recall the pact he made with Jonathan, showing favor to Mephibosheth, the sole remaining son of Jonathan. "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." 2 Samuel 9, verse 7. It's easy to see why God had referred to David as a man after his own heart. With each passing scene, we're given a glimpse into the character of this young man. He is faithful and loving. He is diligent and determined to serve God and his king well. After each attempt by Saul to kill him, David simply returned to duty, conducting himself with honor and integrity. Not once did he attempt to defend himself. We never see him get angry or vindictive toward Saul. He never utters a single harsh word about Saul. All David wanted to know was what he had done to make Saul angry. If he was guilty, he would confess it. If he had done something wrong, he would attempt to rectify it. In spite of all that had happened to him, David continued to treat Saul with respect, viewing him as God's anointed and the king of Israel. Not once do we hear him utter the words, "This isn't fair." He doesn't point his finger at Saul and declare him as the guilty one. He doesn't defend himself before God, or even Jonathan for that matter. He was confused. He was obviously frustrated, but he remained faithful and willing to accept his lot in life as having come from the hand of God. Jonathan made a statement to David that rings with prophetic weight. "May the Lord destroy all your enemies." Little did Jonathan know that his words would come true. God would end up bringing about the destruction of Saul, the man who would become David's most persistent and perplexing enemy. Saul would remain king for the time being. He would continue to pursue David, treating him as a fugitive and as an enemy of the state. And yet David would never feel the freedom to defend himself against Saul. He would never sense God's permission to take Saul's life. For the next several years of his life, David would be dependent upon God's mercy and grace to sustain and protect him, and to eventually crown him as king of Israel.